Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to GivenTutor. If you're joining us from outside the States and working your way toward crushing the GED Social Studies exam, you are in exactly the right place. Today's explainer is all about demystifying the U.S. economic system. If you've ever looked at a price tag and wondered, how on earth did they come up with that number? Or heard the news talking about inflation or the Fed and felt like they were speaking a totally different language, don't worry. We're going to trace the actual history and mechanics of the American economy, starting from the devastating lows of the Great Depression all the way to how things run today. So before we just memorize a bunch of definitions for your test, let's stop and think critically about the hidden forces driving our everyday lives. It is way too easy to just blindly read a textbook, but I want us to look beneath the surface here. Like, what actually dictates how much you pay for a smartphone or, a gallon of milk? The economy isn't just dry numbers on a page. It's a living, breathing system made up of millions of individual choices, including yours.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're hitting 5 key stops today: the free market baseline, the Great Crash, the New Deal response, the modern economic engine, and finally, the levers of the economy.
Starting with Part 1, the free market baseline.
Okay, so at the very core of a free market system is capitalism. In a true free enterprise system, the economy isn't being run by a king or some centralized state. Instead, the tools to make things, factories, businesses, new innovations, those are all owned by private individuals. And what's their motivation? Well, it's profit. That engine of self-interest is literally what drives producers to create things that consumers actually want to buy.
But here's the catch, and it's a huge one: scarcity. See, we live in a world where human wants are pretty much unlimited. Let's be real. We all want the nicest houses, the newest cars, the freshest food. But the resources to actually make those things, the land, the labor, the raw materials, they are strictly limited. Because we can't have absolutely everything, the economy becomes this massive, complex system of deciding exactly who gets what from our limited pool of resources.
Which brings us to a crucial point. In economics, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Seriously, every single choice you make costs you the opportunity to do something else. If you spend your evening studying for your GED, the opportunity cost is the movie you decided not to watch. If a company drops $1 million manufacturing smartphones, well, that's $1 million they can't spend making tablets. It's the lost potential benefit from whatever your next best alternative was.
And this whole dynamic creates the famous law of supply and demand. It's basically a constant tug-of-war. Think about it like this. If demand is sky high but supply is low, imagine everyone wants the newest gaming console but the factory only cranked out a few, prices naturally shoot up. On the flip side, if demand is super low but supply is high, think heavy winter coats sitting on a rack in the middle of July, prices naturally fall, so stores can clear out that inventory. Now that's how a free market hums along in theory, but what happens when that system completely breaks down and the economic pendulum swings into absolute crisis?
That brings us to Part 2, the Great Crash.
Let's rewind to the 1920s to see how a major disaster unfolded. It was this era of totally unchecked speculation. People were using a really dangerous tactic known as margin buying. Basically, they were borrowing money to buy stocks, just hoping the prices would keep going up so they could sell and pay off their debt. But in October 1929, that bubble spectacularly burst. The stock market crash wiped out billions in wealth practically overnight, and it set off this brutal chain reaction. People couldn't pay their debts, which caused massive bank failures. And remember, back then, if your bank failed, your life savings simply vanished. Poof, gone.
Just look at this stark number, 25%. That was the catastrophic unemployment rate during the Great Depression of the 1930s. 1 in 4 workers had absolutely zero job, zero income, and guess what? No government safety net to fall back on. People lost their homes, they were forced into shantytowns. It was a failure of the free market on a scale the U.S. had never, ever seen before. Faced with this unprecedented disaster, the government finally realized they couldn't just stand by and wait for the free market to fix itself. The suffering was just too great.
Let's look at Part 3, the New Deal response.
When you look at artwork and murals from the 1934 New Deal era, you can really see the muscle, the labor, and the raw determination. It perfectly captures President Franklin D. Roosevelt's response to the crisis. FDR fundamentally shifted how the American government operated. Instead of that traditional hands-off approach, he brought the massive power of the federal government directly into the economy to get people back to work.
Roosevelt completely changed the map of the U.S. by massively expanding government regulation. He used a 3-pronged approach: relief, recovery, and reform.
He rolled out a whole slew of alphabet soup programs, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, to physically build out the nation's infrastructure and employ young folks. He created the FDIC to insure your bank deposits, meaning if a bank went under, the government actually guaranteed you wouldn't lose your money. He also instituted Social Security to provide a vital safety net for the elderly. Suddenly, the government was an active, heavy player in the economy.
Moving on to Part 4, the modern economic engine.
Now, while the New Deal absolutely stabilized the country, it was actually the demands of World War II, starting for the U.S. in 1941, that truly ended the Depression. The massive military draft and the total pivot to a wartime production economy required endless supplies, weapons, and ships. This is what finally put millions of Americans back to work. And when the war ended, all that pent-up consumer demand unleashed an unprecedented 25-year economic boom that practically built the modern American middle class. So how do we keep that engine running smoothly today, since obviously nobody wants a repeat of 1929? That brings us to our final section, levers of the economy.
To know exactly which levers to pull, policymakers first need to know if the economy is healthy, and they do that by looking at GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. You are going to see this term constantly on your GED exam. It's basically the ultimate scorecard of America's production. It totals up the value of every single car built, every haircut given, and every software program written within the country over a year. Generally speaking, if the GDP is growing, the economy is healthy.
But hey, GDP isn't the whole story. What you actually feel in your wallet every day are price fluctuations. First, we have inflation. This is when prices go up across the board, which means your purchasing power drops. $5 buys a lot less today than it did 10 years ago, right? Then, on the other hand, we have deflation, where prices actually fall throughout the economy. Now, deflation might sound awesome for shoppers at first, but it usually means there is way too much supply, and businesses are really struggling, which can lead to severe job losses. And this brings us to the role of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. The Fed acts as the nation's financial referee by tweaking interest rates, which is basically the cost of borrowing money. If inflation is raging out of control and prices are rising too fast, the Fed raises interest rates. That makes things like mortgages and credit cards more expensive, which slows down spending and cools off the economy. On the flip side, if the economy is sluggish, they lower rates to encourage people and businesses to borrow, spend, and invest.
While the Fed handles monetary policy, Congress plays a massive role through fiscal policy. This is just a fancy way of talking about how the government taxes and spends. Congress decides how much tax to collect from citizens and businesses and how much to spend on things like roads, defense, and education. If they spend more than they bring in through taxes in a given year, it creates a budget deficit. String a bunch of those yearly deficits together, and you get the national debt.
So, as you continue prepping for your GED Social Studies exam with us here at GivenTutor, or honestly just navigating your own financial life, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If the Federal Reserve raised interest rates tomorrow, how would it change your personal choice to buy a house or a car? See, these concepts, the free market, government regulations, fiscal policy, taxes, inflation, they aren't just dry history facts to memorize. They are active, living forces determining your financial future right now. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep studying hard and always keep questioning how the world around you actually works.